and feel free to ask any questions at any given point in time. This again is a bit of a, as I mentioned to you earlier, this again is a bit of a practical outcome, because when we look at written communication and different forms of written communication, we would generally see that they are used when we are looking at creating records, in terms of for reference in the future. So sometimes, you might ask a question that why do we need to have written communication, or, do written communication? And what are the various methods or styles of written communication? So these are, areas that we will cover in this particular, learning outcome, which is be able to communicate information in writing. Now, as you know, within the health and social care sector, obviously, we have lots of different forms of communication that we do. And sometimes these written form of communications are predominantly done to create records. And when we say records, why we are looking at records is because we need to refer to these patient records, or we need to refer to a prescription or a medication which has been given to the patient. And in order for this to be available, so that nobody assumes or has any assumptions, these are recorded. And obviously, they are recorded on a centralized, system within the NHS. And that would mean that once this information is recorded, it is available to GPs, doctors, surgeons, consultants, anybody who would need access to this information to be able to provide, medical or healthcare services to the patient. Now, there are different forms of written communication that we are aware of, and we'll basically look at them, but we'll contextualize them towards the aspect of what are these in terms of health and social care. The other bit that we are going to look at in the second assessment criteria is primarily going to be how do we communicate using different styles, or what are the different written styles of communication, and how do we do that specifically when we look at, sending communication across to patients, family members of the patient, colleagues, or, other practitioners within health and social care. We'll be also looking at the merit criteria, which talks about use of appropriate technology. And in this case, the use of appropriate technology, which is sometimes referred to as when you are requested or when you're asked to get basically scans or additional tests done. Take, for example, blood test. You look at, ECG, you look at your blood pressure monitor, you look at X-ray scans. So we'll be looking at different forms of communication or outputs which are essentially produced when we use technology or machines or equipment which help us in diagnosing the condition or the, let's say the problem with the patient. And in some of those cases, even a simple thermometer, for example, when you put that across to take temperature, would give you some information, and that is given in a particular form. Sometimes when we look at some of these communications, they come out as output, and what we will look at is various ways in which this can be done using diagrams, graphs, or tables, or supporting information which is useful for diagnosis of any sort of problems with patients. And the distinction criteria talks about, evaluating. So whatever examples we take here, we have to evaluate the different forms of written communication in healthcare setting. That means you have to justify why do you use this form or this format of communication in certain circumstances. And that would be, the arguments that we present. Say, for example, why an X-ray is required, or for example, why additional blood tests are required, or why MRI scanning is required, or why a CT scan is required. So you would need to take up an example in one or two cases and then explain that in order to diagnose the condition, or in order to, for example, discuss the condition, what we will need to be able to do is essentially have this additional, scan done, or use technology to be able to see this information and interpret this information, which then can be used for diagnosis or, for the purposes of treatment of the patient. So these are the bits that we are going to be covering. Now, this is a practical learning outcome, and I'm going to show you the assignment brief as well before I get into it. The reason I would want to do so is because when we look at task 3 in particular, we are going to be looking at, just the practical aspects of it. If you see here, what is required to be covered, it says written styles and methods. We have to look at 5 different types, and out of which 3 of them would need to be produced to complete the task in the assignment, which will be related to learning outcome 3. So here it talks about formal and academic reports, informal reports, letters, emails, and other materials, which could be things like sometimes you provide commentary, and you obviously provide additional information with the use of graphs, X-ray scans, reports, patient information record, which is then used for the purposes of providing treatment or services or healthcare services to patients, and those would be used for the purpose of communicating in written format. And as I mentioned earlier, the written form of communication is primarily done because we want to create records. We want to reference it in the future. We want to be able to use it in the future with regards to a particular patient or a particular condition. And sometimes when you look at information in research, the reason why research is carried out and it is documented is because the learnings from the research or the findings from the research are then put into some sort of a practice or implementation, which would help patient families and in general people receiving treatment to get better soon. And that is on the basis of past records or experimentation observations which have been done, and they are all recorded, and that is why they are done in the written format so that they are usable and reusable in the future. Now, they are also done sometimes because if wrong medical treatment is done or wrong medication is given, if it leads to serious consequences or some sort of adverse effects, then in those cases it can be traced back to say that this maybe was prescribed in error or this was given in error, and that is what has resulted in this particular emergency or, for example, a reaction. And in those cases, again, written form of communication is helpful because we can fall back, go back and see why it was recommended, who recommended it, and obviously pinpoint, in some cases, the errors so that they can be avoided in the future. Now, if I just briefly show you the assignment brief, which is related to Learning Outcome 3, and why I want to do that is primarily to draw your attention towards what will be required to be done, for Learning Outcome 2 and 3 in particular. Learning Outcome 1 is primarily focused on theory, which means you'll be looking at covering the communication models in the task 1. You'll be talking about the use of technology and, how different forms of communication, verbal, non-verbal, oral, and written communication are predominantly done in a health and social care setting. You'll also be elaborating on the use of technology, within health and social care setting. And the last task in, last activity in task 1 is primarily related to talking about the principles of effective communication. How do we remove barriers of communication, and technology in particular can be used to remove barriers, and those will have to be discussed. Now, for extension activities, you're looking at expanding on with examples. So, for example, here in this task, we talk about barriers, but when we talk about cultural barriers, language barriers, we talk about, for example, disability barriers, we talk about barriers which could come across from, lack of communication or coordination. What we'll have to do is propose solutions to overcome those barriers, and they will be covered in the extension activities. And if you make a presentation of how to overcome barriers using technology in particular, when technology comes to the aid to help you and aid you or support you in removing those barriers. For example, we discussed communication when it is done in banks or in places like receptions or hospitals wherein hearing in loops are installed, braille language or sign language is used. And when you use that to be able to remove those barriers, they will complete the extension activities on merit. Distinction, again, here we are looking at a Q&A session wherein you'll demonstrate the presentation that you've prepared, and you'll do a bit of a Q&A session to discuss how these barriers can be removed. And that would involve you presenting like I'm presenting today, but it will be involving you to make that presentation, and all the other colleagues or students on the presentation will be basically asking you questions, and that will help you meet distinction criteria. So it is like a viva or a viva voce that we have to do predominantly when you make the presentation. And the second distinction criteria is basically looking at evaluation of different uses of technology. So here you would be needing to use examples to quote how technology is used in a particular healthcare setting. For example, electronic attendance or registration system at the GP surgeries. A lot of GP surgeries that we go to today, or if you're registered in one, you would generally see that sometimes over the years, a lot of complaints have come up to the practice manager to say, I come in early and somebody gets seen earlier than me. I'm in the queue, but somebody else gets seen earlier to me at the reception. And in those cases, to remove and make the system work fair, in a fair and, everybody's treated fairly, what most GP surgeries have done is installed what is called an electronic system, which means when you come in, you clock your, time in to the surgery, which basically registers what time you came in for the call, and then automatically that system serves to bring you in front of a nurse or a doctor to discuss your query. And that allows, that use of technology, which is automatic lock-in or registration system in the GP surgery, does away with, the mechanical side or the human side of things, but also, creates a fair system wherein patients feel that once they come in, they are looked at in that particular order. And this allows good communication and fair communication to happen. So you would have to take examples like that to be able to discuss in the evaluative criteria for the task 1. Now, task 2 and task 3, as I mentioned, and we have covered yesterday, task 2 in particular, LO2, that it is be able to, that means we need to physically demonstrate, or we need to be able to demonstrate what is oral communication. And here is where I'm going to give you a template, which will essentially mean that, what you're going to do is, how do you look at active listening? How do you look at taking notes? How do you look at, responding to patients when you are in a health and social care setting? Here we are going to be discussing you watching a health and social care video and writing the transcript of it by listening into that video. And that would basically look at capturing some part of task 2.1, which is oral communication. And then the other bit would be to look at a bit of a role play to say that you are dealing with a patient, who's maybe critical or is basically having a severe condition. And here you have the responsibility of sharing that information with the family members or next of kin of that particular patient. And you are looking at using, things that we discussed yesterday, things like, when you're responding, you're basically using empathy, you're looking at using emotive, emotions, and essentially, in some cases, body language is a part of communication to relay the news to the patient's next of kin. And that would be essentially done again through the route of oral communication. Now, in task 3, specifically looking at today, which because we are looking at discussing learning outcome 3, here, what we are looking at is, you are assuming that you are appearing for an interview, and in order to successfully meet the requirements of the interview, what your organization has asked you to submit is at least 3 forms of written communication. At least three. So these could come from, it could be a formal report, a letter, your CV, an email that you've written to somebody in your family, your friend, your boss, or maybe in an organization, any sort of a web page or a leaflet that you've designed, a personal statement that you're making to enter or apply to a university. And all these would be written forms of communication. We need to be able to demonstrate in this learning outcome at least 3 out of these, which are listed as an example, to be able to meet the criteria for pass as far as communication in writing is concerned. Some of the extension activities, again, as I mentioned to you earlier, whatever you produce on this side, you would need to evaluate with the use of an example that would help you cover merit criteria, and then giving reasons or arguments to say why it is beneficial to use this form of communication in this context would allow you to accomplish the distinction criteria. So this is a practical learning outcome, as I mentioned earlier, and what we are going to do is, in order to discuss this practical learning outcome, we're going to look at a few slides, and these slides will be focused on covering, the content which is given in the unit specification, which is talking about the written styles of communication and written methods of communication, why this is done, why written communication is important within the health and social care setting. And this is what we need to cover, essentially in the, this particular learning outcome. So let's look at beginning with looking at 1 or 2 aspects of why do we think written communication is important, and why is it important in the context of, specifically health and social care setting. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, there are, different ways in which we can communicate. These different ways could include things like emails, reports, it could be text messages, it could be presentations, it could be handouts, it could be some sort of, letter, or, some sort of formal material that we produce as an outcome of attending a training, or maybe in this case, you're going to produce an assignment as a student, and these are all going to be forms of written communication. So they tend to be things like essay reports, it could be, a case study, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, it could be the group discussion that you do, which is documented later on as the activity that has been done. And in some cases, these could also mean that you produce different types of evidence, things like letters, emails, informal reports, or academic reports, and they are then submitted for the purposes of evaluation to your lecturer or your teacher. So when we talk about written forms of communication, what could be the advantages which come to your mind? What could be the advantages that you think of are the advantages of written communication? So would you want, obviously I would like you to participate. So what could be the reasons why you think we need to have written communication as against oral communication or verbal communication? Any ideas? Any ideas? Okay, so when we look at, it is important to look at, written forms of communication, is because when we look at written communication, as I mentioned, one of the main points tends to be that you want to create a permanent record. That means it is beneficial to have a permanent record in terms of something which is written down and something which is documented, which can be reused or referenced in the future in order to look at, say, for example, what was discussed or what was said at that point in time. Now, written communication also is done because you want everything to be clear and concise. You want everyone who is getting a copy of that written communication to understand things in the right perspective. You don't want any interpretations of that information. So what you're looking at doing is you're creating a written record which would be circulated to everybody, and that would mean that everybody will read from that single, will read that single communication. It's like saying everybody is singing from the same songbook, and that means there are no ways that any interpretations can happen or confusions or ambiguity can arise. Now, there are other advantages that we can also put. Sometimes when you do written communication, you want it to be available to a wider audience, and in order to ensure that you want, for example, a notice, or for example, a memo, which is sent across in the organization to say, like during COVID in the hospitals, there was a memo sent across by the director of, services to say that these are the minimum rules and guidelines which have to be observed while you're offering or, while you're working within hospitals. Now, this was mandatory. If it was a circular or it was a notice, then it is mandatory because it is related to compliance. So sometimes written communication is also done because you want the written communication to be registered. You want people to follow it strictly, and you want that communication to be met as a route of compliance specifically within the organization. You also, the other aspect of that is that you also want less distortion. That means you want less confusion when you do written communication. Sometimes oral communication can be transferred or communicated from one person to the other, and sometimes dilution of that information can happen. So in order for you to remove any distortion or dilution, then what sometimes tends to happen is that you do written communication, or in a way you communicate that in writing, so that people will have the benefit of reading it, and they will be quickly understanding what is required to be done as far as the work or role or responsibility is concerned. Now, the main part which I mentioned, that why written communication is important within health and social care, is that it records personal details. It is kept, it is done primarily to keep medical or patient records, and it is to issue prescriptions, referrals, things like that. And this ensures that, anything which has been mentioned, anything which has been sent across or given across, allows it to be documented for record keeping. It also means, again, if I say if I'm, just to give you a practical example, if you go to the doctor and you say, I'm having a headache, now the doctor would ask you a lot of questions, do a bit of diagnosis to say, why you've been having this headache? Is this persistent? Is there a particular time that you have this headache during the course of the day? How long have you been having it? Are there any other symptoms related to why you have this headache? So the doctor is trying to diagnose what are the reasons behind this particular, illness that you're having, or this particular symptoms that you're having in terms of headache. Do you have this when you are empty stomach? Do you have this when you're, you work too much? So the reasons of asking these questions is to later try and diagnose and filter down into reasons of why this particular problem would be occurring, so that they can then diagnose and offer you the right prescription. So when the clients, when the patient, or when in this case, doctor has asked these questions and he or she has zeroed it down to a particular reason, in order for that communication to be understood accurately, what he would do or she would do is create a written record, and that would be something which the nurse, the pharmacy, or maybe other colleagues in the practice would be able to look at, and this would allow him to or her to basically carefully choose the words and then prescribe the medication. Any sort of misinterpretation or misunderstanding could lead to critical problems, or lead to severe problems with the patient. So if they feel that this is something which is a mild symptom, they might prescribe you, say, a cocodamol or a paracetamol. But if they feel that this is something which needs to be further investigated, the doctor would make appropriate records on your patient record on the computer system in the NHS, and they would then further ask you to get tests done. So, for example, is it consistent? Is it an acute pain? Now, they would want to diagnose if it's related to any sort of migraine or any sort of condition. And in those cases, the doctor would then recommend further investigation, and that would be, done through the form of written communication. So it creates a track record of how information is shared, it's collaborated, and then how it is recorded to basically look at accurately diagnosing the problem with the patient. Sometimes, as I mentioned, communication is done in writing because it's a legal compliance. It is related to legal matters, and it is compliance related. Sometimes you would see communication is done in the written format in terms of flyers when you go to the GP surgery or in other locations like hospitals, and there would be flyers which are given as printed material so that you can read about a particular condition or a new type of condition which is, or a disease which has been say, for example, encountered. So during COVID, if you recall, the government produced a lot of documentation on the Public Health England website, PHE website, on the NHS website, and they published a lot of information which was primarily meant at educating people about the symptoms of COVID and how it needs to be treated. So sometimes you would see written communication is done in the form of brochures, flyers, instruction leaflets, and they are done predominantly to reinforce any sort of verbal communication or conveyance of information is done to patients or patient families, and this is to help understand their condition and obviously what are the treatment options, and then how to maintain self-care practice in most cases during certain times. So, for example, you would generally see lots of campaigns are done on television during the summer month when the pollen level is quite high, or when we have a heat wave within the UK or in Europe. What you'll generally see, there are amber and orange warnings which the weather department issues, and obviously they give you certain warnings to say these are things that you could do in order to stay cool, or stay out of the heat, because it is going to be extremely hot during these days. And these are forms of written communication which are done for patient education, for public education, and this is one of the reasons why also communication is done in such way. And obviously, one of the things that you will see, whether this is a difference that you have noticed or not, but generally when you are doing written communication, it tends to be mostly formal form of communication. It is professional, it is structured, and obviously it is very clearly documenting what is required, to be communicated, to a person. So you would see that written communication within healthcare is also done for administrative purposes, for writing reports, for sending emails, for memos, any sort of written correspondence which is given in the form of prescriptions or aftercare leaflets which are given to patients when they undergo some sort of clinical procedures. And these are done to basically ensure that the communication is effective. It is registering with the patient and the patient families. It is also not open to interpretation, and it also helps in coordination of various administrative tasks at a later stage when people have to refer to the bits which have been communicated to the patient or patient families. So if we have to clearly understand and justify the use of written communication, what are the various types of written communication, what are the various methods of written communication, we know very clearly how what are the methods: email, text messages, letters, reports, patient records. It could be things like emails, and also related to in the business context, you look at a job description, you look at a contract, employment contract, you look at proposals which are given sometimes when you are essentially, entering into a contract, or you look at writing, for example, reports or assignments in your case as a student. They're all forms of written methods of communication. Why they are done? We have made it clear, and obviously we've discussed, and what are the ways why it is important within the health and social care sector has also been discussed. Now, any questions on this so far? Any questions, anybody, in terms of what we've discussed in terms of written communication, forms of written communication, why it is used, and why it is used specifically in the context of, for example, for health and social care setting. Okay, now let's look at some of the assessment criteria that we have to cover in this learning outcome, which is to look at primarily, assessment criteria 3.1. There is only one criteria that you look at, which is there in the assignment brief and the unit specification, and that is related to, uses of different forms of written communication and how do we use this and communicate to, learners, or say in this case, patients and patient families. Now, you use what it is asking us to do is explain different forms of written communication in health and social care setting. So here, first things first, what I would do in your case, if I have to look at explaining the different forms of written communication in healthcare setting, I would first list them down. So let's list them down in terms of different forms of written communication in HSC. So here in the health and social care setting, if you work within a hospital, GP surgery, a care home, and elderly old age home, things like that, what are the different forms of written communication that you're going to see in a health and social care setting? First things that we are going to look at is medical records. You need to put on your thinking hat and think that you're going to go into a surgery, what kind of written communications you're going to find. So I'm thinking that way, and what I would do is I'm writing things down. For example, when you register with a surgery, you would have basically, prescriptions, medications, which are issued by the doctor, and some part of this in terms of your records with the surgeries in the form of medical records. Now, what could be other things that they give you? For example, referral letters like sick note. If you're not well and you're off work for 3 days or more, and your employer asks you to get a sick note, then you have to go back to your GP surgery and ask for a referral letter. And in this case, this tends to be, a sick note. Now, sometimes you would look at policies and procedures. So, for example, if you want to know about a particular way in which how this thing works, or what are the rules and regulations related to this process or this procedure, GP surgery would normally hand out a leaflet to you, and what they would do is those leaflets would give you or detail out what the process would be, or how it works. And if you need to use that process, say for example a complaints process, you're not happy with, I'll put it this way, for example, if you're not happy with anything and you want to make a complaint to the practice manager, you'll want a complaint process. So what the reception or somebody at the administration in the surgery would do is give you a policy, which is a complaints policy, which will have a form. That is the procedure, and you fill that up, and then you deposit it or drop it into the suggestions box, and then somebody would pick it up within the practice. As a practice manager normally would look into it, and they would then have a discussion. Why do you feel that you need to make a complaint, and what was the reasons? And they'll go into details of it, and they would be examples of written communication. Now, if I look at widely, and not related to a surgery, but look at from a governmental level, they normally print out what are called research papers or white papers. Now, there is a COVID report or an inquiry which is going to be done by the government, which has been, essentially done because of the fact that within the third world, or within the developed countries, UK had registered the highest number of deaths during COVID. So what the government has done is instituted an inquiry, and that inquiry will essentially publish a research paper or a white paper to look into the reasons of why they were look into the reasons of why the number of deaths in the UK were the highest amongst the developed countries. So here this report is going to look into the reasons of why and what could have been done differently. And this at some stage would be published as a research. Now, this research report would be a report which will reflect on any sort of pandemic situation or crisis. If the UK government is to face again, then what could be the actions the government needs to look at taking. Government needs to look at taking so that loss of life can be avoided. So this report would essentially need to be published in a written format, because it will act as a source or as a guidance source for future pandemics if we are to face anything like COVID-19. And this would be again done in the form of written communication. Now, this is something, so here I'm looking at, surgery level, maybe at the district or at the city level. This is also at the city level. This is maybe at the national level, just to give you an idea. And sometimes when we look at communication of, communication from Department of Health. So for example, the health secretary writes a letter, to the health secretary writing a letter to the NHS trust or the, NHS, or, say, for example, any other healthcare, bodies. Then this form of communication is again done because it's an official communication. The government may be changing legislation, policy, and they're informing various key departments and players within the National Health Service. And in this case, this form of communication is again done in a written format. And this would be done by the Department of Health in the form of letter, in the form of a notice, or in the form of a memo, depending on, what is the reason why they're writing it. But just saying that this is something which is done in the written context in, health and social care setting. If you look at other options, what could be the other areas that you see any sort of communication happening? For example, I'm just thinking aloud now. For example, if I had a call from my insurance broker this morning for life insurance. So that's why I brought this up. So if I look at insurance policies, my life insurance policy is up for a renewal. And obviously I had a marketing call from them. They were willing to discuss, the policy, the guidelines, how things have changed, how the premium has changed. And what I requested them to do is, can you send me a communication in written on email to tell me what are the benefits if I do upgrade my policy, or if I do transfer my policy to a new version of the policy, then what are going to be the advantages for me, whether my premiums will go down, things like that. And they would be done in the form of written communication, because I would want to see and ensure that whatever I'm signing in right now is something which is going to be beneficial for me for the years to come, because I would be paying insurance premiums, for my life insurance. So these are different forms of communication, different forms and usages of written communication, specifically within a health and social care setting. I've also taken an example of what the Royal College of Nursing would probably do in terms of written forms of communication. For example, if they receive a complaint against, say, for example, a particular nurse or a particular nurse doing some practice, then in some cases, what you will generally see is that they will need to do an inquiry, and that inquiry essentially, would be done in order to understand the reasons of why the complaint has happened. And in some cases, these complaints would be handled by an independent adjudicator, and they will all take the form of written communication. So here, your idea is to try and understand the various forms of written communication which can happen within a health and social care setting, and why is it done primarily is what you need to be able to explain. Now, sometimes what you will also see is that, written communication is also done in general to instill confidence, or, basically build confidence with, patients, or with, basically, family members of the patient. Now, when we do written communication is generally done in a way, because it's professional, it is structured, it is formal. We always make use of things which we need to ensure that this would have the right, create the right impression, provide the right information or the correct information in a suitable format, and then have the impact which is required when we are sending this information across to patients or family members of the patient. Now, what we need to use and keep in mind when we are writing something and sending across, which are going to be things like good communication or writing skills. So we are ensuring that we are using correct grammar, punctuation, and there are no spelling mistakes. The style of writing tends to be formal. In some cases, it could be informal if you're writing an email, or maybe an informal email, or addressing somebody that you have been speaking to for a while. You have a relationship in place. You have the ability to be able to speak informally, or the information being communicated is not that serious. So in those cases, communications can also use what are called to be. In this case, I might, if I'm a doctor, if I'm prescribing medicine, there has to be a minimum terminology that we should be able to use, which basically helps in establishing the facts. It should avoid jargons. So I should not be using acronyms essentially when writing to somebody, because I might know the acronyms because I'm from the field, but the patient or patient's family members might not know what is an acronym. So acronym could be when sometimes we write OMG, oh my God, or AKA. These are acronyms that you would not write, or etc. etc. So formal communication or written communication in this format would be doing away with any sort of acronyms or jargons, which could be which would create ambiguity or confusion when being used in that particular format. Now, sometimes you would also need to do what is called specialist communication. And this specialist communication tends to be done in the format because of the fact that patients would have some difficulties. Say, for example, it could be disability because of sight, or a hearing disability. And in those cases, the Royal National Institute of Blind People, RNIB, would basically provide instructions in the form of Braille. Now, have you come across anything where you see Braille, examples of where Braille is used? Anybody? Have you seen any examples of where Braille is used, or how does it look like in general? So if I talk about, say, Braille or sign language, this is, for example, how you would generally see, Braille, which is primarily what is called, a form of labeling that can be used on objects, which allows people to use touch to be able to read what is being said on that box. Now, you would generally see the use of Braille, happening on medication, primarily because sometimes when you look at medication that you get from pharmacy, or in some cases when you get it from various places, like as you can see on this aspirin, which you can buy from pharmacy, would have Braille language, or this dotted sign language, which is primarily on the medication box. So this is primarily used when we see individuals who have disability in terms of being able to independently read and write. And Braille is a tactical, writing system which is developed by the Royal National Institute of Blind People in order to ensure that the language, when it was introduced by Louis, Braille in the early 19th century, and that's why it is named after that particular person. He arranged alphabetically what we would normally read if we were having perfect eyesight. We would read, alphabets or characters. But in this case, what he did was he arranged raised dots in specific patterns in the form of cells. And these cells are grouped into lines. And each of this line then contains a maximum of up to 40 dots. And these dots or cells essentially allow the person who's been trained in terms of reading and using Braille language is able to decipher letters of alphabet, numbers, punctuation marks, any sort of mathematical symbols, or even musical notes. And that allows them to do it through the use of touch by feeling the patterns of raised dots with their fingertips. These individuals who are blind or are, having a disability in terms of eyesight will be able to decipher and then comprehend this written information which is put across on boxes. So it is very important when you look at any sort of medication, which we get. Most pharmaceutical companies, as I can show you some examples here, use Braille essentially on the medicine boxes. And this is done in order to ensure that, patients who have disability in terms of sight should be able to, clearly see visible, clearly able to read by using this particular language. And this is the use of specialist communication, when we talk about, one of the types. The second type, when we talk about is, the sign language. So when we talk about British Sign Language in particular, because it was developed, for people who have a disability in terms of hearing. So BSL, as it is called, if I put it this way, British Sign Language, or BSL. Now, British Sign Language is basically a language wherein we are using visual and gestural, body gestural, signs to be able to primarily communicate with people who have a disability, which is basically, in this case, they are deaf. That means they are unable to hear. They have a disability either by birth or over a point in time have had that disability diagnosed. And in this case, in order for them to be able to understand and communicate, we have created what is called the sign language. Now, there are two versions of it. There's British Sign Language and American Sign Language. But basically, British Sign Language uses complex, let's say, somebody who has been trained to use it and understand it would use visual and gestural, methods to be able to communicate to patients who are essentially having hearing difficulty. Now, it has its own variations and dialects, but we normally see this happening on the BBC News. If you watch the Good Morning News or the Good Morning Show in the morning on BBC News, you would generally see there is somebody who's always using, or there is an overlay of, what is being discussed between the Good Morning presenters with somebody who's using British Sign Language and then communicating with people using body gestures and, some sort of visual oblique gestural, poses. And this allows, people with hearing difficulty to understand what is being spoken about, and makes them feel included for all, purposes of social interaction and any sort of services which they need to be looking at doing. So, generally speaking, the British government is committed, to promoting the use of British Sign Language, and in certain places like educational institutions, healthcare facilities, or in government offices, and in some places like when public events are happening, it is mandatory to have somebody, also interpret what is being discussed, spoken about in sign language, so that if there are people within the audience who are participating, they do not feel alienated and they are essentially able to communicate, and use this language to be able to put their viewpoint and opinions across. So these two examples of what I would say, specialist forms of communication, which is using Braille, if I put this here, and the British Sign Language, would be examples of why sometimes you would see, specialist routes being taken to be able to communicate and allow the inclusion. Because when we talk about inclusion, diversity, equality, we need to be able to have these things available so that people feel included and they do not feel that they've been excluded from certain events or certain, for example, functions, or in places wherein people would need to go across to get, support or, get treatment. Then people are, in that case, trained on British Sign Language to be able to use it and obviously promote it. And obviously there is a way that people undertake courses to be able to understand, the meanings of how this is to be done or how this is to be essentially used. Now, there are lots of things that you can essentially look at. And obviously, in this case, when we talk about the British Sign Language and the Royal, College of Nursing, essentially looking at promoting this, there are lots of things that you can do or can be done. And in certain places, I mentioned, like government institutions, or certain events, educational institutions, National Health Service, hospitals, you will generally have somebody who's trained on these, and they would be able to offer these services, to people if they need so in that particular, context. So this is an example of, looking at how the sign language is used. And maybe I've just pulled out one picture to show and, put this into a bit of context. When we talk about specialist, signs of how we would use communication in written format, but using body language and also gestures to be able to communicate across with people having disability. Now, the second assessment criteria very briefly talks about different styles of communication. And here I would suggest that you need to pick any three to be able to complete your assignment. And there are different ways in which you can do this: by writing a letter, by writing an email, or a formal report, which is a patient record, or in some cases a prescription, and they would demonstrate the written forms of communication that are used within the health and social care setting. The merit criteria talks about you looking at an ECG or an MRI or some sort of an X-ray report, and that would need to be shown. Say for example, if we talk about an ECG or an electrocardiogram, we would need to be able to show this as an example. And this example essentially would be looking at showing information in the format which is considered using technology. And that would be a case wherein you present something like this, and that would essentially be useful for the purposes of looking at what is called an electrocardiogram. So if I just quickly create one or two slides as we are discussing this right now, but this is obviously a merit criteria which you would need to get into. And if I say ECG, and this is what an ECG looks like, what you would need to do is explain how technology is being used to do ECG, or use ECG to be able to read information, and that would be meeting the merit criteria. Another one that you can do would be, say, an MRI scan. Sometimes have you ever had an MRI scan? Anybody? So what is an MRI scan? Anybody knows the full form? So MRI scan stands for magnetic resonance imaging. So this is a scan normally imaging. So this is a scan which is normally asked to be done when you have broken bones, or when there are internal organs that need to be looked into for the purposes of understanding if there are any defects or malfunctioning happening in it. So MRI scans are recommended by doctors to look at your brain, for example, your spinal cord, your joints, some of the organs, and some of the soft tissues. And this uses a technique called MRI. So MRI is normally used primarily in the cases when doctors need to look at getting hold of detailed scans or pictures of some of your internal organs. And I don't know how many of you have seen an MRI machine, but an MRI machine generally tends to be a machine wherein you are, if I bring this across, it looks like this, wherein normally the magnetic resonance imaging is the machine generates magnetic radio waves, and they are then used to create structures or get scans of any part of your body. And if I look at, for example, showing you a MRI scan for a bone joint, which obviously in this case a knee joint which needs replacement, this is how an MRI scan would confirm that the patient requires a knee, because as you can see, most of the cartilage has become degenerative, and here the knee function has been impaired. So in this case, the consultants or the GPs would essentially then recommend a knee replacement operation for the patient. So MRI scans are another form of technology which can be used primarily for the purposes of basically interpreting information. The third that I could use is X-ray. So a lot of us have had X-ray scans in the past, and I know personally from myself, when I talk about an X-ray scan, if you've broken a bone or if you've had a bit of an injury wherein you're not able to essentially see what is broken, then in those cases what will happen is an X-ray scan is normally recommended by the doctor, and that X-ray scan tends to be done for a bone, or for example for a tissue wherein it requires treatment, or if there is additional treatment which needs to be done. And this X-ray scan tends to be for example, if in this case a dislocation of bone has happened, as you can see, this would be an X-ray scan which would be required, and that would essentially mean that people would, use this to read why, the particular form of plaster, or say, for example, technique has to be used to fix, a particular condition. Now, X-ray scans or ultrasound scans are also done when ladies obviously are looking at, giving birth. Sometimes when you need to listen to, the vital stats of the baby inside the mother's womb, you would also see ultrasound scans which can be done. And these are all examples that you will have to take for the merit criteria, because they would essentially help you, show that appropriate technology can be used in the form of graphs, charts, tables, and diagrams to be able to diagnose and use this as a additional method of communication while diagnosing or treating patients within the health and social care setting. Any questions on this so far? Okay, last but not the least, we come to the distinction criteria. And again, it says evaluate examples of different forms of actual written communication found in health and social care. So here, what you will need to do is basically take out actual records. For example, if you had a prescription from a doctor, and what you would need to do is basically show that prescription as a record, and that prescription as a record or a patient record that normally exists. What you would need to do is basically have that, and then write about that particular patient record, and that would help you essentially meet that distinction criteria. So if I put a picture across here, now this is a hospital patient record, and this is an actual example that you're taking to discuss the different forms of written communication which is used in health and social care setting. So if I also say say for example a prescription, which is normally given to the patients, and if you have a prescription record that you can bring across, something which probably demonstrates why you need medication, or how do you give this to a pharmacy, then what you will generally see is this is again an example that you're taking, and that would be good enough to meet that distinction criteria. So this is a prescription record which is essentially showing the different forms of written communication which is actually done within a health and social care setting. Now, you could have other forms of records that you could produce, or if you've got them, they would also be useful, and they could be things like if somebody's had, for example, a surgery, and if they've had a surgery, sometimes what you will see is brochures and flyers are provided to patients for the purposes of let's say after you had undergone a surgery. Now in this case, if I just show you an example, you would have something like maybe if you understand, say for example, if somebody's undergone a cardiac surgery, what the hospital would then provide is information to how to recover from the cardiac surgery. And this would be a actual example of a record that you can see, which has been produced by a hospital, which is given to the patient, and is an extensive piece of documentation, which is essentially using a report or a leaflet, which is in an actual form of written communication that you will see within a health and social care setting. So these are various bits that you would need to cover by using an example in the learning outcome 3 for merit and distinction criteria. And they would be, without the use of examples, you won't be able to get the merit and distinction. And that is why these examples you would need to research a few. And then once you find them, you are going to use snapshots of these to be able to put them across in your presentation for the purposes of, achieving the merit and distinction. So with this, we come to the end of this particular unit and our discussion on learning outcome 3. And what I've done is updated this particular slide a bit in terms of our discussion today. And this slide would be available upon Moodle shortly, and that should allow you to go into and start doing the assignment as far as this particular unit is concerned. So any questions that you have, feel free to ask me now. or if you think of any, you can also send them on email to me at raman@ukversity.co.uk, and I will be happy to provide some part of the information that you need to be able to complete this particular unit. So thank you so much for attending, and I will speak to you in the coming weeks to look at starting the next unit, and that would essentially help you, give you about 2 weeks time to be able to complete this unit in terms of the assignment, and then the schedule for the next unit would be sent across by Jill, which will allow you to start attending sessions with us for that from the first week of August. And just very briefly looking at going into this particular presentation to show you up on Moodle, while some of you are still there, I would just basically ensure that some part of this is uploaded and it is available to you within the communications unit here. And that bit is now available. So I'm going to put some, additional documentation across, for certain types of reports, as I mentioned, so that you're able to, actually use it for the purposes of, the assignment as well. And these are 3 particular reports, which sometimes, you might not be able to find them, but here from these reports, you should be able to take extracts of these, which are going to be useful for you to achieve, the merit and distinction criteria. So let me put this across, and I'll sort that out for you now, Fatima. Just give me 1 second. Let me just quickly show these reports, which I have got. So this is one of the reports which I have uploaded now on Moodle. You should be able to, access it for the purposes of merit and distinction criteria. There's another report which I will show you, which I've uploaded, and that is this report, which is again a leaflet from the NHS on cardiac surgery, and should be useful for you to showcase and bring that into your assignment for distinction of league merit criteria. And the last one, which I've already shown, which is a leaflet which has been produced for the patients and the family members by NHS if somebody is undergoing the cardiac and heart surgery. Let's look at, so this basically concludes this particular session, and I hope this has been useful, for you in terms of covering the learning outcome 3, which is primarily be able to communicate information in writing. And we have understood what are the various styles and forms of written communication, why it is used in the health and social care sector. And then we've covered all the assessment criteria related to learning outcome 3.